Professor Tyson, I'm very happy to have you here. We're going to start the series about Ammonites, Moabites, Edomites, ancient Jews who are totally different from modern day Jews. People have to understand that neither Jews nor some other modern nations are not 100% same compared to ancient times. Of course, this is my statement. I'm not going to impose anything. But regarding Ammonites, what we know about them? Were they a distinctive ethnic and social group, or they
Yeah,
belong
no,
to a bigger group of Semitic people?
yeah. So I'll just respond to your first your opening kind of comments to agree with you in general that I think it's easy, it's simplistic, I think, and easy to make a identification of current people who live in a particular space with ancient people who live in a particular space. And when they share that space, um, they certainly, would suggest, share something of a cultural, some aspects of cultural heritage, especially those connected to the physical space. But as you said, that doesn't mean they are the same the same
Yeah,
people or something
yeah,
like
they're
that.
not
So,
carbon copy of the same people.
right. Yes, that's not how history works as far as I understand.
True.
But anyways, the Ammonites, so the earliest, information we have about the Ammonites comes from about the ninth century, with the ninth century BCE, when we get the Ammon Citadel inscription. And this seems to be the very first, the earliest, reference. And it doesn't mean that the Ammonites didn't exist prior to that. They most certainly did. But if you want to like stick with the evidence in terms of like, here's the first thing we can start meaningfully talking about the Ammonites, that's where I would start. They do seem to be their own distinct people. They're are organized, at least on the, from the outside, they seem that they're organized around kinship. This is their name, the sons of their children of Ammon, is what they call themselves. It's also what they're called by in the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament. They're called the children of Ammon. So it's both a internal and external name. And this is, we don't know who or what Ammon was. Most people want to think of it as some kind of ancestral name. The name itself is its structure is kind of disputed, but it seems to be related to an ancient Semitic word for people, Am. So the name itself has a family resemblance to it. In any case, the Ammonites, the sons of Ammon, uh, another way to kind of think about them maybe is that the name Sons of Ammon is a royal family name or royal name. It's possible that there were other kinship groups, other tribal groups in the area, and their tribal names were simply kind of subsumed under the ruling group's name, the Sons of Ammon. Whatever the case is, as far as that's concerned, the Ammonites lived in and around modern day Ammon. It's where the name Ammon comes from or is connected to, and extending up north to Wadi Zarqa, roughly speaking. And the southern border is a little harder to track, maybe down to, roughly down to Madaba or something like that. Seems to be where a rough boundary is with the Moabites, although that it's hard to tell. It could be somewhat fluid. There's no lines on a map, unfortunately. They really flourished in the 8th, 7th centuries BCE, especially under the Neo-Assyrian Empire, as the Neo-Assyrian Empire expanded into the Levant in the 9th and then significantly in the 8th and 7th centuries. the Ammonites became a vassal uh, to the Assyrians, and it seems, at least from the record we have, that they were relatively, I don't want to say relatively compliant. They do not seem to have rebelled often, if at all. And this is a trade-off for them. It means that they have to give up some of their freedom, give up some of money, the tribute that they would have to pay. But at the same time, it allows them to operate, um, relatively freely to take their own cut of whatever would be moving through the area. So this is really the time that they're flourishing. And as far as the material culture is concerned, it's where we get the most distinctive, what we would, generally call Ammonite material culture, is during this period of the 8th and 7th and down into the 6th centuries. So that's kind of a broad overview, but
Were they related to Moabites? Can we relate them to Moabites, or they were a distinct group in terms of language?
so as far as language is concerned, the Ammonites, Moabites, Edomites, the Israelites all
Yeah,
share, and on up if you want to go up into Phoenicia or whatever, they all are using some form of West Semitic, Northwest Semitic. The um, the language, as far as we can tell, we don't have a lot of written Ammonite. We have mostly a few inscriptions and a whole bunch of seals, which mostly have names on them. So we don't have like a large corpus of Ammonite to be able to compare really well to all these other languages. But from what we do have, it appears that the Ammonite script, so the actual writing, is more similar to the Aramaic script. The language, however, as far as we can tell, is more closely aligned with Hebrew. Although there are a few things in it here and there that suggest some continued interaction with Aramaic. So, for example, I don't know how deep in the weeds you want me to get, but for example, you do get the word for sun in Hebrew is bane, and the word for sun in Aramaic is bar. And you do see bar occasionally in Ammonite inscriptions. You also get bane too. So there's like this,
yeah.
kind of switching back and forth on certain occasions. But largely speaking, is similar to Hebrew. Not as close as Moabite is to Hebrew. At least the Moabite we have is almost exactly Hebrew. Doesn't seem to be a significant difference, although there are a few things. The Ammonites and Moabites, were they, completely different people? I think they, as far as we can tell, thought of themselves as somewhat different, at least at the ruling level. Uh, did the average person think of themselves as different? Don't know.
Yeah,
Maybe not.
yeah.
Um, that's always, always a question. And the people living out in the towns and villages and wherever else may not have cared about the ruling dynasties. Maybe they did. Some of them probably did, right? But they, it's not 100% clear that they would have thought of themselves as completely different. Certainly, they were organized along similar lines in terms of kinship. So those things are shared. Culturally, as far as the material culture is concerned, there's a lot shared by Ammon and Moab and Israel and Judah, frankly, too. Pottery traditions are different. Uh, as you get in many areas, traditions develop slightly differently depending on where you are geographically. Did that mean something to the people in their own thoughts? That's a little harder to get at.
What was the political relations between Ammonite Kingdom and Egypt on one hand, and Mesopotamian kingdoms that you already
Mm.
mentioned? Because they seem
Yeah,
to
so
be in a buffer zone.
yeah. When you say buffer zone,
Yeah.
what do you have in mind?
I mean that the Ammonite Kingdom was between two superpowers,
Hmm.
Egyptian kingdom and Neo-Assyrian kingdom. So they were
Yeah.
kind of a statehood, one of statehood between these two kingdoms, and they had to balance between superpowers of that time.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable way of talking about it. Especially when you get into the
I'm a
ninth
reasonable
century.
guy.
Yeah, oh, that's good. Um, Here's how I tend to think of it. I think a buffer zone is a decent way to talk about it.
Yeah,
Um, and if you think of it that way, the, the Ammonites, along with some of the other people in this area, were having to deal with the Assyrians and earlier, also, I would say Damascus was a significant power in the ninth century that the Ammonites had to deal with, or at least we suspect they did, because the Damascus was very powerful in the ninth century. But getting down into the eighth century and seventh century, Egypt was sort of at an ebb. There was not a lot going on in Egypt. I don't want to say there was nothing, but it was the Assyrians were really at their height, and so it was largely the Assyrians that the Ammonites had to deal with. Also, to some extent, the Arabs coming out of the desert were a significant power. Not a territorial power in the same way that Assyria was, but certainly because they were mobile, many of them were mobile, they had this kind of irritating presence for the
yeah.
empires. And certainly the Ammonites would have had to deal with them on and off. I think the way I think about where Ammon is positioned is that it's, the most important part of it is its geography for the Assyrian Empire. Did the Ammonites provide any goods that the Assyrians needed? It's not clear they did. The things that they could have given were wool, um, olive oil and wine, although the Assyrians could get olive oil and wine from places much closer to their heartland, so it's not clear that that was necessarily the case. Um, and the things that we do hear about being transferred to the Assyrians are mostly gold and silver. So, and there's no gold and silver in the Ammonite area that we know of, or no significant deposits that we know of. So it suggests that what the Ammonites were doing, and in all likelihood, also the other, groups of people in this area, is that they were taxing caravan trade going through their areas, and then some of that tax money would then go, pay to the big guy
Exactly.
in Assyria. So that seems to be the relationship. But as long as the Ammonites were, I don't want to say okay with it, but as long as that was kind of tolerable to them, they could continue to operate in that space, getting some of the advantages of the trade moving through the area, and paying off the Assyrians as needed and cooperating as needed. So that seems to be their role. And I would say similarly for Moabites and Edomites, it's kind of a similar thing.
I mean, history and archaeology indicate that Ammon flourished during the period of Neo-Babylonian Empire, which is 626 and 539 BC.
Mhm.
Some scholars disagree with that notion.
Yeah, I walk kind of a fine line on this one.
Yeah,
I try to, as much as I can, stick to the evidence that we have, and the evidence that we have is very small.
yeah, exactly.
So there is a passage in the biblical book of Jeremiah that has some people have pointed to being evidence for Moab and Ammon being destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar in 582 BCE.
Yeah,
My own analysis of this text suggests that Jeremiah was putting, excuse me, Josephus,
yeah,
who worked off of Jeremiah, was putting some things together between Jeremiah and some of the other biblical books and like interpolated this fall. And so I think it's kind of, we can't say for sure. 582, it's possible, but it's not 100%. It's also possible that Nabonidus, the last king of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, was responsible. There is a inscription in southern Jordan at Aselah. I don't know if you're familiar with it, and it is about Edom, so it's not specifically about the Ammonites. However, what it suggests is that Nabonidus made his way down through Jordan, down to Tema is where he was headed, down to, into the Arab peninsula, Arabian Peninsula. And it suggests maybe that's when the Ammonites and maybe even the Moabites met their end, although again, we can't say for sure. What we can say, this is where it's like we have an end point, but we don't know exactly what the beginning point was, is that by the Persian period, we have several stamp seals that suggest there's a Persian province of Ammon. And so at least by the Persian period, whether it happened under Nabonidus or whether it happened under Nebuchadnezzar in the Babylonian period, they had been subjugated, turned into a province that then the Persians inherited. So by the Persian period, they're no longer an independent polity. They're a province of Persia.
What was the official religion of of Ammonites?
Was the official religion?
Yeah, because they were polytheists.
Yeah, they were polytheists. So I think as a polytheistic group of people, I don't know that there was an official religion. There might be, you might be able to distinguish, kind of a state or royal religion that would be under, as far as we know, Milcom, who is the deity that is identified in the Bible and also in a few Ammonite inscriptions that seems to take that place of the high god, or at least the god of the ruling elite. But there are plenty of other gods and goddesses for which there is evidence, mainly on seals, stamp seals in people's names. But also we have some iconography here and there that suggests there are other gods and goddesses. So in a polytheistic system, you can have various ways that the gods and goddesses interact, and that's going to differ between the ruling elite and the average person on the street, who may not really care that much about the high god and may be more concerned with their daily affairs. And so they may look to other gods and goddesses for those things. But as far as we can tell, Milcom was the high god of the ruling elite, parallel, at least in the minds of the biblical authors, to Yahweh in Israel and Judah, and also to Chemosh in Moab. So that seems to be the case.
So probably he has the same characteristics of Yahweh.
Similar, yeah.
Or
I mean,
similar.
again, we're sort of stuck because we don't have a ton of evidence, but yeah, as a high god, it seems that that's the case, yeah.
Did you work as a scholar on some of these sites, like Tel Hisban, Omairi, or Sahab?
Yeah, so I have worked at Umeri for a number of seasons, and then in recent time down in Moab at Bulua. So those are the sites, and also, excuse me, I've also worked at one site in Moab at Khirbet al-Mudanya, Thamid. So that's just kind of, on the boundary between Ammon and Moab, roughly speaking. So those three sites are places that I've worked at.
How significant is Balua? I had a conversation with a friend of mine, Ian Jones, who also works at Balua. He's from San Diego University.
Oh,
Maybe
yeah, yeah.
you know each other,
Yep.
definitely. And I had
Yes, we do. Yeah, we're friends.
I had a podcast with him maybe four. I had 4 or 5 podcasts with him, and one of them was about Balua. How big is the
Hmm.
site, and do we know the occupation of Balua? Balua is on the Karak Plateau. It's south of Madaba in Moab.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Yes. Yeah, I mean it is the largest Iron Age site in Jordan that we know of. The it's about 16 hectares large, and about 13-ish of those hectares are covered by an Iron Age, Iron 2 city. There is off to the kind of east, or excuse me, off to the west
yeah,
of the site. There's also a Roman period part of the site, and then like a Mamluk or Islamic period site. And fortunately, as archaeologists, it's nice because they weren't built right on top of the Iron Age site, so you have these distinct areas as a site. But yeah, as an Iron Age site, it's gigantic for in Jordan, and even bigger than most sites in Israel and Judah.
yeah.
So we it seems to have been at its height in the Iron II, starting somewhere in the 9th century and down into the 8th and 7th centuries, with a massive fortification wall, casemate, double wall system that goes around the central part of the site. It's once you put the two walls together, and then there's space in between. That's about 7 meters wide, so it's quite large, substantial.
Of course.
And then there's off to the east, there's like a newer, we tend to call it the new city. We don't know the exact dates, but a newer part of the city off to the east that was built outside of the original fortification wall. So yeah, it's a huge site, and I think we certainly have to assume that it played some major role in controlling traffic moving north-south. It's right on the lip of Wadi Balua, which eventually ends up in Wadi Mujib. So it's not the only access point, but it is one access point to traversing Wadi Mujib and being able to come out on the other side. So I think we have to assume that it played some role in that. It's way bigger than Dibon,
Yeah.
and Dibon is where we tend to think of, because Mesha was from Dibon, we tend to think of Dibon being the capital city in the 9th century. Uh, Archaeological remains from Dibon, if you ever get a chance to talk to Bruce Rutledge,
Hmm.
was excavated there. Most of what they have is from the 8th and 7th century, so there's really nothing or
Yeah.
very little from the 9th century, which is interesting because that's when Mesha said, that's when Mesha's doing his work. Um, so exactly how these, like the cities or such a city below, south of Wadi Mujib relates to what was going on with Mesha north of Wadi Mujib, we don't know yet. We can make some speculations, but we don't have like written evidence that is telling us, uh, you know, Mesha was here and I built this city or something like that.
Exactly. What primary and secondary sources do we have about Ammon Ammonite religion? Because
About the Ammonites.
yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
Do we have plenty of sources, or primary evidence and secondary sources evidence is scarce, insufficient?
Very scarce.
Yeah.
Um, Depending on how you think about this, I guess I would say my approach has been to try to provide the most reasonable dates I can for all the sources. And the earliest inscription that has anything to do with Ammon is from Shalmaneser III in 853, is Battle of Karkar, which appears to reference the Ammonites as one of the groups of people that came together to fight the Assyrians. So this was
Mhm.
before they were a vassal. Um, so that seems to be the earliest. Now, depending on how you look at the Bible, you could say, well, there's things in the Bible that seem to be earlier, but if you date the biblical text, like when were the biblical texts written? not what's the time that they talk about, but when were they written,
Of course.
you're going to find that they're all written sometime, 7th, 8th, 7th, 6th century. So you have, of course, the story about Lot and his daughters in the book of Genesis. And this is the, story about the, where the Ammonites and Moabites come from. This would be Lot and his daughters after the whole business with Sodom and Gomorrah. That, to me, and to many scholars, is a origin story or origin myth, and it's both sort of a slap in the face to the Ammonites and Moabites because it says that their ancestors are the product of incest. At the
Yeah.
same time, it also shows that there is a relationship. So, but it is a relationship, a relationship rooted in brotherhood or nephew and uncle. Okay.
Yeah.
But when was that written? Probably sometime in the 6th century or something like that. So it's a later reflection on the origins of Ammon and Moab. So really 9th century is the first thing we can say about the Ammonites, and really all we can say is they seem to have been part of a coalition that opposed Shalmaneser III. And then we have some gap in time
Of course.
until we get down to the some of the Ammonite inscriptions.
What's the relation between El and Milcom? Are they the same deity, or they're two
Mm.
different deities?
Yeah, so this question is again somewhat difficult. El
Of
seems
course.
to be is one of the high gods or is the high god in much of the Northwest Semitic pantheon. And if you're familiar with scholarship on Israel and Judah, you'll know that there's a whole set of scholarship that suggests that Yahweh, as a weather god or a storm god, eventually became either merged with El, or otherwise took over El's role as high god, at least in the stories and mythology of the Bible. And some have suggested a similar kind of thing for Milcom and El, although there's much less evidence. But so here's two things. Milcom in the Bible is presented as the god of the Ammonites, parallel to Chemosh of Moab and Yahweh of Israel and Judah, and Astarte of the Sidonians, etc. And we do get Milcom in a couple of names related to the royal, the kings of Ammon in like the 6th century. So it suggests it's connected to the royalty. However, the large majority of Ammonite names that we have on inscriptions have El as their theophoric element.
Yeah.
So that's the mass majority of them. And so it suggests or it raises this question, why, if Milcom is the state god of the Ammonites, why is his deity name doesn't appear in more people names?
Yeah.
And so some people have suggested that Milcom and El are really just the same god, and that Milcom is an epithet or a kind of other name for El. And I think this is probably, at this point, probably the best way to think about it, although it's not 100%. And one of the reasons I think it makes sense to think about it that way, number one, is because of all the names that we've mentioned with El, but also because Milcom, at its root, is a name that has to do with kingship. The MLK, and then with the mimation on the end, the MLK part has to do with ruling and kings.
Yeah.
And so it suggests that Milcom is kind of an epithet of El that is connected with kingship in Ammon. And that's really the best, I think, the current best way to think about it. There may be more evidence in the future that overturns that idea, but right now that's kind of where we are.
Thank you so much. Do you want to add something for the end, because we have 4 minutes and 44 seconds? It sounds like basketball when you have 24
uh,
seconds for
you're
the
gonna take the
attack.
shot.
Yep. And you have to think how to organize the offense.
Wow, I don't know. You don't have any more questions for me?
No, not for now. I'm going to
Yeah.
talk with you in the future. I'm going
Okay.
to continue, and maybe we're going to have a longer conversation, let's say of 1 hour,
Okay.
if it suits you. This is
Yeah, no, that's fine.
the initial conversation and introduction into Ammonites and Moabites, ancient Israelis, ancient Judah, because these
Yeah,
territories were economically, politically, ethnically interconnected.
absolutely. Yeah. I think the maybe the thing I would end with here, and it's just a kind of point of how we think about how we go about thinking about these ancient peoples is to personally, I tend to prioritize the archaeological and inscriptional evidence that we have where we have it. We don't always, sometimes we just don't have evidence, right? And that's a problem. It's a problem you face everywhere. It's just having very limited evidence. And then I tend to think of the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament as most often a secondary source.
Mhm.
It's most often someone else talking about, the Ammonites and the Moabites, and
Yeah, the third
often
parties. Yeah,
that a third party, right? And often it's also much later than the time.
of course.
It's not written at the same time that the events
No,
are happening, right? It's
you have
written
a big
in
gap.
retrospect,
It's
in retrospect
retrospective.
about
Right.
those events. So there's a few or a couple, one or two possible exceptions to that, where a text in the Hebrew Bible may be contemporaneous with the events that it's reporting, but those are few and far between. Most of them are, secondary sources looking back on something. So that's where, I try to walk that line as best as I can to try, and really, although it's often sort of boring in terms of like getting at the details, you have to date these
No, but
texts, both
of
the,
course, the real science is often boring.
it is.
If
That's
people
right.
want to find quick solutions, they're not going to waste time on a thorough research. But then
Absolutely.
it's something else. It's a popular culture or popular science for elementary school.
Right. Agreed. So
Thank you so
no,
much,
that's
Professor.
that's
Yeah,
it.
please.
Thank you.
We'll keep in touch, and I'm planning to publish more of your research in the JT.
Okay. Sounds great.
So thank you so much.
All right, we'll be in touch and you have a great day.
All the best.
All right. Peace.
Bye bye. Peace.